Something I should have mentioned yesterday. When the Spanish squadron got to Calais to anchor, the 30,000 fellows they were supposed to meet weren't even close to being ready. They figured 2 more weeks, and therefore that's when the whole thing started to snowball in the wrong direction. Okay, while we're thinking about that part in history, I thought you all might be interested to learn more about a British ship of the line, a first-rate ship of the line. HMS Victory was Nelson's flagship at the Battle of Trafalgar, and she was in fact the first, or not the first, but one of many types of her ship. So nothing I'm saying today means that she was unique. She was one of many, but let's take a look. I'm still me. I've met more interesting people in the last 72 hours. Keep them coming, stop me anywhere, anytime, talk about ships or airplanes. Quick look into the future. Tomorrow we sink the Bismarck. We talk about the ocean liners, the development of them, shipwrecks in time, the great ships of history, and we wrap up with kind of a whimsical presentation I call Funnels, Flags, and Funny Paint. Well, let's talk a little bit about Victory, the ship, the life, the battles. Is this a woodworker's dream come true? Well, that guy had a job for the rest of his life. Here's another picture of Victory. But like many other navies, ours included, the Victory we're going to talk about was the last of many in a long line. In 1569, the Crown had a little 42-gun ship named Victory. Later, an 82-gun ship. 1695, a 100-gun ship that burned and sank. Never good. 1764, a little schooner. So the names keep reappearing like they do in our Navy. But why the Royal Navy to begin with? Well, this isn't rocket science. If you're an island nation, you need a great Navy to A, protect your homeland, and B, let's be frank, impose your will on those around you as your crown sees fit. So it was both an offensive and defensive force. In addition to that, of course, the Royal Navy ranged far and wide and helped set up colonies all over the world to include Guadeloupe, Martinique, Trinidad, Cape Colony, Mauritius, all over the world. But our girl for today had 104 guns and was what we call a first-rate ship of the line, which we'll get into very shortly, what that means. A very brief overview of her early history. She was laid down in 1759, launched 6 years later, cost what would be $10 million today. Holy moly, naval architecture gone wrong. She was too wide to get out of her construction dock. Wouldn't you think someone might have measured this before? But by carving down the sides of the ship, carving down the sides of the graving dock, they were able to get her out. But, she listed to starboard and her lower gun ports were too close to the water. This is not good naval architecture. But she completed her sea trials in 1769 and sadly was immediately laid up in reserve for some number of years until 1778, when she in fact participated in the American Revolution. On the wrong side, I would suggest. Okay, talk about ships of the line. When I was a kid growing up, I heard the term, oh, this was a second-rate or a third-rate ship. And that always made me feel kind of badly that, oh, this was some kind of quality cut of, stick that guy in a third-rate ship. He's no good, not a good skipper. But it was strictly a correlation with the number of guns the ship had. If you had over 100 guns, you were first rate, and on down to fourth rate, 50 to 60 guns. Interesting point, USS Constitution, one of our great ships, was a 44-gun frigate. She would not have been a ship of the line in the Royal Navy. Too few guns on Constitution. Here's a nice side view of Victory. 186 feet long, tremendously long bowsprit, 205 feet tall, 52-foot beam. She was a quarter as wide as she was long, not terribly trim, but she was actually fairly quick sailing for her day. And this next slide I put in is just kind of a matter of interest. Historians think that she consumed between 5,000 to 6,000 oak trees in her construction. So if you ever wonder where the great forests of Northern Europe went, between the Royal Navy, the Dutch, the French, the Spanish, the Danes, that's where the trees all went. And I also show this as a matter of interest for the checkerboard. The checkerboard pattern of the gun ports was not a coincidence or a mistake. They figured out that if you put the gun ports in a line vertically, that created weak points in the hull, and the ship was just physically stronger if you built her like this. So they did. Here's a cutaway of the ship. Again, not terribly long. 850 men lived on this ship. This was a very, very dense operation. And I've read time and time again that a lot of people think that these ships, the first-rate ships of the line at that time, were the most complex things that man had ever made to that time. And I'll show you now, we'll come back to this. Let's see if this works. With 850 men aboard this ship, one man, the captain, got all of this territory. One man, the admiral, got all of this territory. 848 got the rest of the ship. It pays to be a captain or an admiral in the Royal Navy, or it did then. Overhead view of the ship. We call these the weather decks. Obvious reasons, it's the decks upon which the weather could be experienced. We have the forecastle, again, a morphing of the term forecastle. You may recall the images of ships with big, they call them castles. Forecastles where soldiers would fight from. That was called a forecastle that morphed into the term forecastle. The waist of the ship where the boats were stowed, the quarterdeck, and the poop deck, not what you think. And the captain and the officers would actually fight the ship from the quarterdeck. That's where the officers were during the battle. And we'll come back to that in a little while. Up front, the bow of a ship is also known as the head of the ship. And that's why we call where we all go to do our business on a ship the head, because the facilities were in the head of the ship. Now check this out. 848 men, they had 3 two-holers for 848 men. Must have been busy in the morning. That's all they had. In the waist of the ship, they stowed the ship's boats. And again, on the quarterdeck, this is where the captain fought the ship from. And sadly, there is a plaque here aboard Victory. Here Nelson fell, 21st of October, 1805, one of the great admirals of British history. And the poop deck actually was where the communications and the flag hoists were run from. That was their communication center. And the captain down here could yell up to the signals. She was called ship-rigged, had a foremast, mainmast, and a mizzenmast with a bowsprit. Had various yards. You've all heard the term squared away. Man, that guy is really squared away. That came from square-rigged ships. If a ship moored in the harbor and her yards were trimmed 90 degrees to the ship, like they are here, the yards were said to be square to the ship, and therefore the ship was squared away, and it was always good to be aboard a squared away ship, whereas if they left the yards askew, unseamanlike, not a good look. The ship had 37 sails, although she could not rig them all at one time. She had 6,500 yards of canvas. Now think about this. An NFL football field is 100 by 53. 5,300 square yards in an NFL football field. This is 20% greater than an NFL field. lots of canvas, lots of canvas. 4-course topsails, 4 topgallants. I wonder how long it took people to learn this. It must have been half a lifetime. Spanker, the fore and aft sail, mizzen topsails, mizzen topgallants. So much going on here. And we're going to look at this in a second, but these little shrouds here, just remember those. We'll come back to those. Here, we'll come to them next. Those are called futtock shrouds. And the only reason I make a point of showing these to you is because someone in this room is going to win $1,200 sometime on Jeopardy when the young lady asks them, what are these? And these actually are there to support the tops, the fighting tops, which in turn support the upper parts of the mast. But to get to the top, you actually come up the ratlins, and if the ship is heeling, you actually are going out almost horizontal to the water on your back, up and over, up the futtock shrouds to the top. Must have been a tough way to make a living, unless you use the lubber's hole, which is, I think, the way I would want to go through. I wonder how many people fell to their deaths off the yards of these ships. They have jibs, flying jibs, lots of sails. And my favorite here is Victory had what we call studding sails, pronounced stunsails. And what they were extra booms that they could extend from the ends of the yard arms to bend on yet more canvas to get the max amount of speed out of whatever wind they had. Good news is it looked cool. The bad news was they were very complex, and when they failed, they tend to destroy lots of rigging with them. And it was found, they deduced in about the 1840s that this concept just wasn't worth the trouble. It was just more trouble than they were worth. But they did make you go faster, and they made you look cool. And it's all about looking good. Victory's rigging was prodigious. She had 20, can you see me? But she had 26 miles of cordage on the ship. 786 pulleys. That's a lot of pulleys. Here's a stern picture of the various galleries. And again, as we saw early on, can you imagine being the carpenter in charge of this? And as we'll soon see, the captain's cabin, the admiral's cabin, then the wardroom for the rest of the officers. Let's take a look at the captain's cabin. Again, that's the area immediately aft of the poop deck. Here's the captain's cabin. One man in 850, but he has a pretty nice piece of real estate. Here's an overhead view. He has a day cabin, a sleeping cabin, and a dining room, all for the old man. Please note, he's sharing his accommodations with 4 guns. No such thing as too many cannons on a ship. The black and white checks. This actually is very tightly stretched canvas. It's not tile, it's not painted wood. This is painted canvas. And this is the old man's day cabin. Here's the sleeping cabin. Oops. Nelson, remember, he had one arm shot away earlier in his life, and he asked the captain, Captain Hardy of the ship, to rig for him a gimbal bed that was actually suspended from the overhead, and it was much easier for a one-armed man to get in and out of. So that's kind of a unique Nelson bunk. Also of note is the captain's secretary had his own cabin here, as did the ship's master, who was not the master as we talk of him today, but he was the fellow in charge of sailing and the folks who were making the ship go. But you can see that the skipper had quite a nice piece of territory here. And the captain's gallery here in the corner, that was the captain's private head. And if you watch the movie Master and Commander, they actually did a good job on that in that movie. And they showed the skipper's privy. You had to know what you're looking for, but it was there, and that was really a very well done show technically. Here's the master's cabin, Again, he was in charge. He was the warrant officer in charge of the sailing crew. And again, his roommate looked a lot like a cannon. The admiral's cabin. Holy moly, check this out. This is one man now. Again, day cabin, 4 guns, sleeping cabin, 2 guns, anteroom, 2 guns. The admiral, this is where Admiral Nelson lived. Lots of boom boom. He had his own quarter gallery as well, which kind of makes you wonder, does it all go downhill? I don't know. I wonder where the skipper, I hope the skipper bypassed the admiral on the way down. Nice digs. Here's the wardroom, the lowest of the 3 large galleries. This is for the rest of the ship's officers. This is a pretty nice setup. This is how the officers lived in the Royal Navy back in the day. I mean, that's right, that's rather attractive. And then below the wardroom was a room called the gun room, which was where the warrant officers' mess was. And this large beam here, we'll get to in a second, but that's the ship's tiller, and was controlled by a set of rigging from the ship's helm down, across, and back, and it was all done with ropes and pulleys and so forth, and that's how the ship was steered. And here actually is the mess with the tiller right over the table for the mess. Again, sharing the room with guns. It was all about the guns. Speaking of guns, here are her 3 gun decks. Upper gun deck, middle gun deck, lower gun deck. Do not think I would have prospered at 6'5" on the middle or lower gun decks as low as they were. Moving forward to this black box here, ship's galley. Large cast iron stove where 850 meals were prepared 3 times a day, such as they were. One of the most important spaces in the ship, because what's the one thing these people feared most of all? Fire. And if something fell out of the oven or the stove, or if it broke and got hit in combat with a cannonball and hot embers came out, it really could be serious. But that's where the ship's galley was, and that's where they cooked the chow. Here's a little fake fire they have in there. Sick bay for the sick people was up high and forward. It was in one of the brightest, most airy parts of the ship for the well-being of the sick people. A couple of little hammocks here for the sick people. Up on the forecastle, let's take a look at the ship's guns. She had 2, 1 on each side, 68-pound carronades, weighed 2 tons each, could barely go a half a mile, took 6 men to work. 7.5-inch bore. On her upper gun deck, she had 12-pounder guns. They could shoot roughly 3/4 of a mile, weighed about 1.5 tons, 4.5-inch ball, 12 pounds. Wow. 10-man crew to service this gun. On the middle gun deck, where I would be bumping my head constantly, she had 28 24-pounders, 24 being the weight of the ball. Can you imagine the din and the cacophony of just